Weinman, I just sent you an email, which I'd be grateful if you could bring up. I sent two links. If we could do the second one first, that would be great. The second web address. All right. We've got lots of different overlapping themes, but why don't I pause for just a minute or two here at the beat? Well, no, let's wait till we have a few more people. Yeah, no, okay, we have almost everybody. Is there anyone that has a big question, a more general question to ask about your papers and especially my general comments? And if there's anything, we could take just a few minutes on that, as I know that's on your minds for sure.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So when we're doing our papers and we're trying to weave in the materials from class, how many papers would you like us to touch upon, ideally, or authors?
Nothing specific. I would say, thinking of your topic, it's not so much authors as I would say ideas. Which ideas make sense for your paper? I think that's the question I would ask to answer for everyone. That is, think of the big, most useful ideas from this course that could help you for your paper topic. And so when I say this course, I mean the general cultural area as illustrated by stuff here. So for instance, there might be, say, maybe from 3 or 4 sections of the course. I bet everybody could draw somehow on 3 or 4 sections of this course. And it's not, don't feel you must summarize the ideas of the author in any detail. Focus on how they relate to hypotheses for you in your paper. So if you're thinking of retiring at 35 or the idea of working harder in China, you've already done your literature review on working hard in China. You're taking the course because you want to learn a little more and you don't have any alternative hypotheses for China. So you can use this course to say, what are some competing hypotheses? And they can be either more abstract or more concrete, like what is work? And so in both your cases, for instance, people are retiring from a time-paid job, but in both cases, they may do Calvinist style or religiously inspired good works. They may do charity. How do you conceptualize that, for instance? In both your cases, this doesn't fit with the way that you had framed them before, but you know that, and so the answer is go to Max Weber, go to other discussions of work that may be something later on, Engelhardt. That's one concrete example that fits with 2 of you, and it's not so much the name as thinking of the issue in your context of your paper. I'd say that's my main answer, and then try to get 2 or 3 competing hypotheses from Max Weber's idea of Calvinist good works, and how does that reconcile or not with the website and the quotations and the other literatures that each of you are working from. And similarly for the rest of you. That is, what I'm trying to say is, don't think of it as something separate. Think of how can it help you in the whole paper. That's the idea. Holism. Your paper and to integrate past work, specific hypotheses, boxes and arrows, how these are competing boxes and arrows, and how you are looking for evidence that will distinguish between hypothesis 1, 2, and 3, for instance. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, anything else like that anybody wants to raise? Okay, we got a lot here, and
I have one question. Sorry.
okay, sure, go ahead.
So as to the relation of the readings to our paper. So I suppose the premise of my paper corresponds to the Durkheim Week solidarity in particular, less Weber legitimacy, but that too. And I'm wondering if we could use the readings in that sense as well, rather than to correspond to particular hypotheses. But then again, one could say, the fact that you're premising your paper on one of these suggests that it's implied within a hypothesis. But yeah, just could we use them in different ways, or should they correspond particularly in that way?
Any way is fine. Just think through again what I said.
Mhm.
Integrate your whole paper. Don't see this as something separate and outside. That's my main answer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very good. We got several disparate pieces here. The biggest section is on the political culture part, but so yeah. So let's do more of that. Alman and Verba, Lipset, American exceptionalism, Lipset and Rokan, party systems and voter alignments. These are big ideas, and then this went into the class politics debate. The Alman Verba reading is important, for instance, for Wen Mu in her paper, because it doesn't talk about China. It talks about types of nationalism and types of conceptions of the nation in a comparative manner. And many people, several of you, are working on China, and you talk about China, China, China. That's not a theory. You got to say, what is there about China that makes China different from South Korea or Taiwan or others? And that means getting to more abstract concepts like egalitarianism, hierarchy, and battles between them, which you have in many other countries. So what Alman and Verba did was not to study one country. They did the first major international study of political culture, called the civic culture, and including the US, UK, Germany, Mexico, and Italy. But they didn't talk about them as countries. What was critical was the dimensions and the ways that they had a typology of people who were either, to simplify, sort of people who were dominated from the top, and they were subjects. They would only speak when spoken to. They would bow and be polite to their superiors. And that went back, and that goes back, whether it's the feudal hierarchy in Europe, whether it's the bureaucratic mandarins in China. This is hundreds of years before the Communist Party. This goes back to what's in Max Weber's history of China, and why it's different from the West. Okay, that big dimension is sort of hierarchy and more egalitarianism is a major dynamic internationally. It's the core idea in this book here, The First New Nation. Here's an early picture of Seymour Martin Lipset as it's a middle-aged man. Okay, we'll see him a little bit later. But what I'm doing is, what we're focusing on here in my comments are concepts, not dates, not country names. And so what they did was to capture this with questions, and then to review the literature about this from Schills, from Lipset, and from others, and pull it together, and then contrast extremes and where these dynamics work together. This same kind of typology is also in Wildavsky and Mary Douglas. And I'll talk a little bit about them in conjunction with this. as we proceed. And maybe I'll just leave Alman and Verba at that very general level and go right on to American exceptionalism. Okay, Lipset, well, sorry, let me, no, before I do that, I'll even do it I'll switch here. I'll do it a little more historically. Lipset, as we'll hear a little bit, came from a New York Marxist background, Jewish, and he'll talk about that. He then used the idea of Marx and class for roughly half of his career. And the book Political Man was a summary of this classic class-oriented politics, which he and many others developed in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. But at the same time, he writes at the end in the appendix that some of this is really not working so well anymore. We're looking for new ways to reconceptualize how political decisions are being made. And in this transitional phase, I was arguing with him. He was working with Stein Rokon. He was working with the Committee on Political Sociology of the International Sociological and the International Political Science Association, and having meetings which led to this book, which is still the classic on cleavage, political cleavages internationally, not just class, but other cleavages. And Stein Rokon is a great Norwegian analyst of these patterns within the different European countries. Then they had experts from multiple other countries, and they would meet and meet and meet. And I started out working with them on political sociology and started working within the ISA, and that in turn led to our Scenes project, which is in the next section of the course. So I'm just saying these personal linkages were also connected to the ideas. The big idea here is, what are the basis of cleavages and how is democracy different in places around the world? And we talked a little bit about the Barrington-Moore idea, contrasting England with France, with Germany, and then as having stronger and weaker democracy, and then getting basically to Russia and China with minimal democratic tradition. And so in both cases, you had revolutions. And it was only with the revolution and with the imposition of the ideology of the Communist Party that the political system changed. It was not following Marx. It was not the bourgeoisie that was revolting. It was a vanguard party, as Lenin wrote about it, with intellectuals and leaders of the party, same thing with Mao and the Long March, military party leadership. Okay, if that's Barrington-Moore, that in turn informs some of the discussion here. And so what they add and what was distinctive was to look for social cleavages. Class was one. Second was linguistic, which could be also subcultural or religious in different parts of the same country. And so the most obvious cases could be, say, in different republics of Russia, where you might have Muslims as well as Orthodox Christians in different republics. And there were some Christians and okay, I won't try to make that point too simplistically. The third cleavage was basically rural-urban, very visible, actively discussed around the world today. And that rural people coming to big cities can create problems for the cities if they engage in crime and in the case of China, there's been a strong effort to keep rural people in rural areas, unlike the Latin American case, where you have lots of revolutions coming from the favelas and battles between subgroups. So if you will, how does rural urban get redefined? That's what the Barrington-Moore book does, and what in turn they elaborate here. That is, rural and urban are not geographic regional, they are cultural. And the cultural identity of people can then become more gentlemanly and helpful. As it doesn't have to be Chiang Kai-shek beating you down. You can be an English gentleman, manor house leader, and you can support the disadvantaged in an English village. And that's the model of the English democracy, which persists in the House of Commons today. That is, you have exceptions, but at least that's the model that Schumpeter, that Barrington Moore, that et cetera, have written about as probably the most important global example of democracy in the world, is the British House of Parliament. Okay, so let's with that brief overview then mention that Lipset then went through, after doing this book, he was at Harvard with Talcott Parsons for, I don't know, 5-10 years. He wrote a book on the history of Harvard. And he showed in that book that Harvard, and it's right from the beginning, the students at Harvard were fighting in student politics the same way they were at Berkeley in 1968. Okay, so he pointed that out, and some of the cleavages that intellectual students, universities tend to be challenging and moving toward change. And so where this happens, I want to elaborate a little more as we proceed. The Rokon-Lipset paper then includes a fair amount of Parsons. I would say, don't worry so much about Parsons here. Focus mostly on the chapter that they cite. Well, no, I won't. I'll just say, focus on the European historical variations, and that's the most important, bigger point. And the simple idea that we have three different kinds of cleavages, and that rural and urban can be redefined. And the way they got, the one historical way that this happened in England was that the bourgeoisie, if you will, to use the class term, had homes in the country, and they would go there on the weekend. And so back and forth, they joined both the rural and the urban in ways that having a strict city versus land, bourgeois versus peasant or landowner does not capture. Okay, let's push on with a bit of, okay, so then what did Lipset go, where did Lipset go next? In his earlier book and multiple writings on this, he really had the two concepts. What's American? Egalitarianism and achievement, doing things yourself, succeeding, whether it's in making money, in creating a new scientific idea, or something else. He then kept pushing further and thinking about this. And in the book, American Exceptionalism, he introduces a perspective which includes five dimensions. And can anybody remember those five? Anybody look at the book? Okay.
It was, I'll go to the section in a moment, but it was individualism, liberalism, egalitarianism. I think there were two more, but I don't remember all five off the top of my head.
And that's terrific. You get an A for getting that far. Liberty, egalitarianism, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire. Okay. Okay, so you can find this. Well, we'll hear a little bit about it more generally, but those are the core ideas which add, if you will, in addition to the equal. Instead of just saying egalitarianism, he's adding explicitly populism for the political system. And think of Trump. I mean, this was 20 years before Trump, and laissez-faire, which is more the entrepreneurial anti-state explicitly. That is, the founding fathers wrote the American Constitution explicitly to weaken the state by having the judges, the legislators, and the president competing with each other directly. That's the opposite of the European and the general tradition of most countries in the world. Okay, and that continues, of course, in the ideology of the political parties and in individual populist leaders who say the fount of legitimacy in America is the citizens. And that's the explicit populist theme, which has grown stronger with greater, it's an extension, of course, of egalitarianism. But it's, and you have this in many countries of the world today, including China, including Brazil, and so forth. But each of these obviously have very different historical legacies combined with these. Okay, let's listen to a little bit of Lipset and of Lipset's exceptionalism, and start, if we could, with the second, if you please, Wenmeo, if we can listen about from roughly minutes 4 to 7 of the second website. This is on the background of Lipset, his own background, and in New York growing up.
Professor, the second link does not work.
Great. Okay. Why don't you do a little? Okay. While I'm talking, you do a little search on Lipset American exceptionalism, and you'll get it again. Instead of my trying to do it with you, or look, yeah, or if you go to the, maybe try the other one, try the first one, and that takes you to it's almost the same site. One's a full hour and one's a 3-minute clip. And if you get the page that had, I think they're both on the same page. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we got the full trend. That's great. And this is the 3-minute. We don't want the 3-minute version. Well, okay, let's take it. So I don't want to make everybody wait. Let's take the 3-minute.
Than others. And by the way,
that's fine.
I wrote down a lot of things you write about and how we're different than others. And by the way, define American exceptionalism.
Well, the term, as you know, was coined actually by Alexis de Tocqueville in his famous book, Democracy in America. And Tocqueville, who was here in the 1830s, said America is exceptional, by which he meant it is qualitatively different than European countries, particularly his native country of France. And then he listed all sorts of ways in which it is different. And many of the ways in which Tocqueville stressed the differences are still true, and a lot of those he didn't stress have become true, and some have declined. For example, we're an ideological country, a thing which Americans, don't realize since they take their country for granted. But the United States was founded around an ideology contained in the Declaration of Independence. And we talk about Americanism. And Americanism, in the sense of the American creed, as Myrdal called it, is an ism, an ideology, in the same sense that liberalism or communism or socialism are isms. It's a set of values, a set of doctrines about the content and nature of the good society. And we've projected this on the population. We differ, we fight among ourselves as to what we mean by Americanism. But we have some unity about the notion that there are various American values. We talk about people being un-American, by which we mean that they don't believe in the American creed. They don't follow it. Now, one doesn't talk about people being un-German or un-Swedish or un-British. And the reason is that the other countries, all other countries, are historical countries. What defines them is that they're people who live in the same areas, have a common culture, a common history, but not a common ideology, not a common value system. There was another ideological country, and that was called the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union, as you know, broke up. But and as an ideological country, we were, and to some degree still are, a revolutionary country. That is, we think that we'd like the rest of the world to be like us, not be part of us, the way say the Soviets thought of it, but to be like us. And sometimes I put it, before 1917, at the time of the Russian Revolution, Washington was what Moscow was. That is, Washington was the center of the world revolution. And people who wanted to create democratic societies in Europe, and overthrow the monarchy, overthrow dictatorships, would come to the United States for R&R. Garibaldi, Kossuth, Sun Yat-sen, all came here to rest up between the revolutions in their own country, but also to raise money. They'd go on national tours, and Americans would hail them and give them money because we thought Hungary or China or wherever should become a democratic.
Okay, that's fine. So that's his general statement. Let's do just a little bit on his background. Do you find the other link on that same, almost on that same website? Okay, look around. If you don't find it from that, do a Google search on Lipset American Exceptionalism, and you should find the correct full. I made a mistake in pasting it, I guess, but it should be right there. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, add video, type video after the title of the book. Okay, yeah, that's right at the top, 58 minutes. That's it. Perfect. And let's go to minute 4.
C-SPAN Publications, 1616 Main Street, Lynchburg, Virginia, 24504.
Right, yeah, drag over.
In the United States. I spent 3 years in Canada, different times. I spent a half year in Germany and a half year in Britain. I guess those are the longest stays.
What took you to Germany?
Oh, I was giving a course. I was teaching, actually, at the Free University in Berlin. I've been there on shorter stays, but that was my longest stay in Germany.
And what took you to Canada?
Well, originally, my first book and study was a study of a book called Agrarian Socialism, which was published, I think, in 1950. That was my doctoral dissertation at Columbia. And what happened was I was a young socialist at the time. I was interested in the question, which I still am, of why the United States is the only country, the only industrialized country which doesn't have a significant socialist movement or labor party. And Canada, which hadn't had one, suddenly developed one, then known as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. And they won an election in the province of Saskatchewan and formed the government. And at that time, I thought Canada was more like the United States than I now think it is. I did a book about Canada and the U.S., and I pointed out a lot of differences between them, which I think helped explain why Canada has had a socialist party of some significance. But in any case, I got a fellowship and went up to Saskatchewan for a year and studied the party, the government, and so on, and ended up with a book called Agrarian Socialism.
You were a young socialist.
Right.
How did that happen?
How did it happen? Well, I guess I can explain in part how it happened. I grew up in the Bronx in New York at the time. My father was a printer who was a member of the Typographical Union, the organization I also did a book about. And he was a socialist of some kind. He wasn't very active in that. This was a Jewish working class area, I guess more garment workers than anything else. And really the dominant atmosphere around there was socialist. In fact, there was a park about a block away from where I lived, where on weekends the men used to gather, as people proverbially did in Union Square in New York, and stand around people who were arguing and discussing. And the people who were arguing were communists, socialists, anarchists, Trotskyists, Lovestonites, every variety of leftist you could think of. And I think one never heard about Democrats or Republicans. So most of them probably voted that way.
What did it mean to be a socialist?
Well, it meant at that time, and this was in the late 30s, late 30s, I was active when I was in high school, it meant that one thought that a lot of the problems, and at that time they were tremendous economic problems, mass unemployment, my father was unemployed on and off for most of the Depression, were the result of the system we called capitalist. And that the notion, I thought, grossly simplified or wrong, that you could solve these problems by the government controlling the economy.
Okay, let's go ahead to minute 27. That's good background.
an urban area. It takes them 2 or 3 generations to catch up. That was one of the Jewish advantages, by the way, that Jews in Europe were much more urban. They had to live in cities. They couldn't live on the land, so that they could deal with cities and the requirements of city life. Blacks, like Poles, if you take Polish, a lot of the Jews came from Poland, but a lot of the Polish Christians were largely peasants. And they also didn't do well. And I mean, they did much better than the blacks, and by now they're doing quite well. But it took them a couple of generations to get over this handicap of being rural people in an urban area. One of the problems that Chicanos face today is the same thing. They're peasants who have come to an urban society. Well, that's, part of it. But then there's, of course, the fact that the whole tradition of race, racism is a real thing. It didn't disappear in 1960. The position of the blacks has improved, actually. As one of the things I suggest in the book is that there has, in fact, been a tremendous improvement in the position of the blacks since 1960, not only politically but economically as well. But it still leaves them, a lot of them, most of them perhaps, considerably behind the average white population, and certainly far behind the Jews.
But you do say here that, you quote Henry Louis Gates as saying that studies that never before have so many blacks done so well. Mm-hmm. And then you suggest that the black leadership never acknowledges the progress.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it's part of a general pattern. If you want more, that is, if you're a trade union leader, if you're a feminist leader, if you're a black leader, if you acknowledge that you've got a lot, that seemingly reduces the value of the argument that you need more. And so black leaders are constantly emphasizing how bad the situation is, how little progress has been made, just as a lot of the women leaders do. When in fact, now, as I said before, they're certainly far from equal, but they also certainly have improved the situation tremendously from what it was. But they don't want to acknowledge it. And there have been studies made in which, samples of black leaders have been interviewed, whether there's been progress made in the last 10 years or whatever. And invariably, the large majority of them say, no, there has been no progress, or there's been retrogression. At different times when the black population has been interviewed, the majority of them say there has been progress and that their personal situation is better. Now, that's varied with the social and economic conditions. During recessions, blacks suffer worse than others, and so blacks will not say it's better. But on the whole, there's a gap between what black leaders say the situation of blacks is and what the average black American says it is.
There's one sentence I always wanted to ask you about. The American left, from Jefferson to Humphrey, stood for making equality of opportunity a reality. Mm-hmm. Is Thomas Jefferson of the left?
In his day, he was. I mean, whatever would be, obviously, what one means by the left, or what the left has changed over time and varies from country to country. But if you divide politically groups between those who are trying to push for a more egalitarian, I would say, what characterizes the left, moderate, and from the right, is that the left presses more for egalitarianism. More egalitarianism. That is, nobody wants an absolute egalitarian. And Jefferson, who was the founder of the Democratic Party, the so-called Democratic Republicans, they were the more egalitarian party. The Federalists, which was the party of Alexander Hamilton, were the, I don't say conservative, but less egalitarian.
On the same thing about the left, you have a chapter, or a subchapter saying television's distorting picture, and you write, there can be little doubt that the predominantly left views of reporters affect the way the news is presented. Do you think it affects the way people vote?
Well, probably somewhat. Though, I also make the point, if I can not amend that in the book, that the biggest bias of the media is not left or right, but bad news. That is, that good news is not news. If planes land, nobody reports that. If a plane crashes, it's news. And that's, of course, true for everything. So that what you get if you watch the news or read the news is a steady dose of bad news, of negative information. If you take the economy, we have all these stories about downsizing of major corporations. We don't have stories about upsizing, namely the growth of all sorts of new companies. I spent a lot of time out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Silicon Valley is these days is a kind of economic paradise. There are tremendous new companies opened up. You read the San Jose Mercury, and they're begging for workers, and this is true in a large part of the country. It is also not true, what you read in the media, that the new jobs are all bad jobs. In fact, the meticulous study of new job creation, and we have many more new jobs than any other country in the world by far, is that most of them are good jobs. It's not true that most of them there are certainly bad jobs among them, but the good news is somehow not reported much. The bad news is reported. Stories, you know, the New York Times ran a series recently about downsizing, which I think is just wrong. And the most economist thing that is in terms of a picture of what is happening in the economy. But I think somehow, you know, you think this is what will get readers' attention, what will get viewers' attention. And of course, television is a much more effective conveyor of the news, good and bad, in terms of influencing people's attitudes than the print media, because the print media you can think is biased. You know somebody's writing something for you. Television, you think you're seeing the truth. And so if television shows you pictures of bad things happening, you're much more likely to believe it and react to it than from the print media. And so the growth of television as the conveyor of news has, I think, increased our malaise.
I tried to count the number of books that you list here, and I got either 21 or 22 that have been written since 1950, when you start out with the agrarian socialism, to 1995, Jews in the New American Scene with Earl Raab. Raab. What is the number? What book is this?
I don't know.
What audience were you writing for and when did you get the idea to write this book? Well,
in one sense, I've been writing it all my life, or all my literate life, because you know, the term American exceptionalism, while, as I said earlier, applies generally to that America is different, it's an outlier in all sorts of ways, but the most striking form of American exceptionalism, and some people even think that that's what the term means, is that the United States is the only country which doesn't have a socialist party or Labor Party. And that was, to say, my original interest in when I did my first study. And I've had this sense or knowledge that America was different, and particularly politically and in terms of stratification and so on. And I've been interested in trying to explain it and understand it. And I've argued, as have a lot of people, that the only way to understand a country or to try to study a country is comparatively, that is, compared to other countries. That a person who knows only one country doesn't know any country, because you're not sensitized to what is unique, what is different, what is special about your country. So that a lot of the things, I wrote a book over 25 years ago called The First New Nation, the United States in a Historical and Comparative Perspective. And in that book, I compared the United States as a developing country in part to other developing countries today. Ironically, one of the reviewers, in fact, the reviewer of the book in the New York Times, at the end of his review, criticized me because in this book I didn't compare the United States to the developing countries. Well, I could say I did it in an earlier book, but I did a book some years ago on, you know, I've done a lot of work on Canada. In fact, I can claim to be fairly exceptional or unique in that respect, because Americans just ignore Canada. You know, Canada is regarded as somehow another minor league United States. It's not very interesting, not very different, and people will say as boring as Canada. I think there was some reference to Al Gore, that he seems almost like he's a Canadian, meaning that he is boring. I find Canada, however, a very interesting country, precisely because there were two countries that came out of the American Revolution, the United States and Canada. Canada is the country of the counter-revolution, where the revolution failed, which remained the monarchy, which retained the state church, and so on. And hence, that was part of my early efforts and continuing efforts to explain the United States by looking at the way Canada and the United States differ, one having retained the monarchy, respect for the state, much traditionalism, and the United States quite different. And in this respect, a number of my books and articles have been about trying to understand different aspects of the United States.
Let me list a bunch of things that you have in your book. That America, United States, highest crime rate, most incarceration, people in prison, most lawyers per capita, the lowest percentage of eligible voters, the highest rate of voluntary organizations, the wealthiest country, the most productive country, highest population in college, commitment to work, least egalitarian income distribution, and the lowest provisions of welfare, the lowest to provide welfare. Pick any one of those, and let me just pick one out of here. Let's say the wealthiest country. How do we compare to Japan?
Oh, we're wealthier in terms of real income, that is in terms of consumption. You know, there's a debate because there are two ways, at least two ways of measuring income.
Okay,
One
why
is
don't we stop
by
there?
exchange rates.
Okay. You get a flavor of what he's been doing, and I'll just add one more interesting point about culture and change. One or two of you have asked, how much is culture an independent or a dependent variable in Lipset in general and in this book? And I would say both. Sometimes independent, sometimes dependent. And so and sometimes more descriptive, that is not even identifying causal mechanisms. One causal mechanism was the American Revolution, which led to a number of people who supported the king, the state, tradition, and they migrated north and they moved to Canada. Whereas people who were more entrepreneurial, individualistic, egalitarian, they were living in Canada, they moved south, and they've continued to move south, such as John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a classic leftist economist at Harvard and had a big impact in discussion of American democratic politics and economics, Canadian. And as are many other famous so-called Americans are actually Canadian. So this kind of migration is one individual way that culture can lead people to respond to it and to adapt to it. But others are, how does the system change? And one of the most dramatic conflicts in terms of the fount of much of the democratic model, England, was the transformation of the Conservative Party from before to after Margaret Thatcher. And Lipset talks about it a little bit in another section, which we didn't have, namely that she could choose her own constituency, her own regional area where she would run from. Did she choose an upper status, rich area? No, she chose the most Jewish area of the UK, middle class part of London. And what her revolution was within the Conservative Party was against those aspects of the Conservative Party, which were tradition, hierarchy, and respect for authority. She, in that sense, was a market egalitarian. And so that was shocking and new. And Margaret Thatcher was hated by many English citizens, as well as of course the people on the left. And most of the local officials, most of the mayors were Labour Party. So there were huge battles going on, and she never won, I think, a true populist majority of the electorate. She got elected sort of through Parliament. So this is illuminating in the sense, and Lipset makes the point of the Jewish background, that Jews within London did not have the connection to the land that is stressed by Barrington Moore, and as is stressed, as Lipset pointed out, with the Poles in the US. Related, how did the Conservative Party change, and how could one make sense of this, either as a cause or a consequence, or what did it consist of? The smartest, most creative anthropologist in England who then worked with Wildavsky, Aaron Wildavsky, who was working on these and who learned from her. That is, after the Proposition 13, the taxpayers' revolt in the US, Wildavsky dropped his incremental theory, or said it only applies in a very limited way, in limited context. And he then looked for a broader framework, and he took the 4 dimensions that came from Mary Douglas. And so those 4 include slavery on one extreme and individualism and markets on another. But when this came to England, she was very unhappy. Her husband was the director of research of the Conservative Party. They knew what that meant very well. She was raised not as Lipset talks earlier about and of course Tocqueville, from the Methodists, the Evangelicals, the Calvinists. These were small sects within religion here, which were the opposite of the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church in Russia and Greece and so forth. And organizationally, they were part of the classic conservative party's respect for the state, which of course you have even more strongly in Asia, and bound up with the family and seniority and the like. So Mary Douglas, in interesting videos I use in other classes, talks about growing up in this way, and she loved tradition. So Margaret Thatcher was particularly shocking to her. And so what did she do? Did she just argue ideologically? No, she did field work. In that sense, she was an anthropologist, but where did she do field work to understand Margaret Thatcher? The economics department at the University of Chicago. She came here after the tabloids in London, when Milton Friedman landed, that they said, "Milton, England hath no need of thee," and that play on words from the famous English poet. Mary Douglas came here and read, talked, went to workshops with Gary Becker, Milton Friedman, and the others, and said, you know what? How are you different from the traditional Conservative Party? And the big difference was the market. And so the market obviously was not invented in Chicago. It's mainly Adam Smith. It's these Scottish philosophers who really built most of these core ideas that were taken, but they were taken and then refined and elaborated in Chicago here, and more generally as the core ideas of markets and how they work. So she has a book, her later books incorporate this in ways which deal with stronger individualism than was appropriate for the Conservative Party, even until quite recently. So Margaret Thatcher, so the point I'm making here that Lipset also is making is that culture changes. Culture changes with a revolution. People can migrate. The political party system changes because you have a Margaret Thatcher who manages to win. And then she in turn learned more. Well, she was an Oxford economics student. Mary Douglas was not. She went to University of Chicago to try to see, what are these views? How do they work? How do they address families, love, inheritance, things that Gary Becker was writing about as a professor of sociology and economics here. That is extending economic ideas to all manner of things, which were sometimes treated as cultural. But the use then of cultural thinking in a stronger individualistic through the market kind of way was a revolution for the Conservative Party of England, for anthropology. Very few anthropologists have ever learned that amount of market analysis and used it seriously as is done here, but not because, but because we are in England and in the US, we are tribes that the anthropologists are now studying. Mary Douglas was making the point, we the people studying tribes need to understand the villages that we're working and living in better. And that in turn led to focus on cuisine, on food, and other daily activities, including fast food, including all kinds of things which are part of our daily lives, which she generally would write about for the second half of her career. But she would build up in that way. Similarly, for Lipset, I mentioned the decline of the class model and the rise of a focus on culture in his later work. In conjunction with this, he and I had I can say I wrote almost all the paper called "Our Social Class is Dying," and the title was exaggerated. It did generate a debate, which went on for about a decade and continues today. Lots of people are still talking about this, but the point, and it summarized the ideas which you can read about more in the next week. But the book listed here is The Breakdown of Class Politics, which is an edited book of many participants from especially Berkeley and Oxford, who attacked us as soon as this paper came out. Within a week or two, they had counter papers attacking us right away. So this in turn went on. The people who started it dropped out, John Goldthorpe and Michael Hout, but their students, they each had co-authors, kept meeting with us, and we all kept meeting and changing our ideas. And Lipset in turn gave up his Trotskyite Marxist background and moved toward this cultural stuff in ways that we still are trying to keep elements of them together, as we saw in Daniel Bell's reading at the beginning earlier on, where we have cituses, where we have feudalism, slavery in America as a situs, and that's still the activist section of political black-white politics, which Lipset was talking about, and it's being featured by a Jesse Jackson or Black Lives Matter today. Okay, so the point is not that classes are dying or dead, but that other things are becoming more important. And so that's another way to link Lipset with Bell, that Bell's idea of these different hierarchies of status and so forth, we can think of as women, gender differences, environmentalists, the Proud Boys, radical left, radical right. Different subgroups may have different dynamics, and we can analyze the Proud Boys, Jews, Blacks, within a bigger framework, which includes the kinds of things which Lipset is talking about historically. And if we update and adapt the kinds of dimensions, by adding new dimensions, and I'm using these examples, so I'm trying not to do too many, but a couple of key examples of social class as Political Man goes down and American exceptionalism comes up in his own work, or for Mary Douglas, the tradition, the idea of hierarchy and tradition, as in the Anglican Church, the Roman Catholic Church, or the traditional Conservative Party, that gets replaced by markets with Margaret Thatcher in ways that had a big impact on English and international issues around the world after 1989, more globally. Okay, I've covered some of the big themes I want to in this section. I think, just let me look here once more. Yeah, let me stop there. That is and then we can go on with the next section. But let's have some discussion. And if there are any ways to link this to your own papers or to themes that we've talked about in other readings and other sections, let's do so. But I've put out a number of ideas, independent and dependent variables, linking, of course, with Blaylock. Lipset has shown many other examples. Let me stop here and have some discussion.
I can jump in, and the topic of American exceptionalism is interesting to me because the movement that I'm looking at seems to be primarily grounded in America. Most of the leaders in the space are American. It has a global footprint, but it seems to be concentrated in America, and I have different theories about why that's possible. But I definitely can see how I can link that to that Lipset's concept of American exceptionalism.
How does that relate to work? I guess would be if you're, and this is good for you and for the Chinese working on work being embraced by the Communist Party in China. But get any follow-up thoughts beyond it's American?
Not exactly a follow-up, but just to complicate Taylor's comment by throwing in, I guess, my and Teo's investigation of the Proud Boys. They also rely heavily on American exceptionalism as part of their identity. And I think this notion of, I mean, although our focus, well, his focus is on gender, mine is more on the notion of patriotism and egalitarianism, despite their anti-democratic claims. Where was I going with that sentence? Oh, so I think all of these notions kind of play a part in developing this American identity. And I guess my question in general to the class, in conjunction with Taylor's in general, is how can you, who does this identity correspond to? How can some segments of the population lay a claim to it? And I guess in general, how does this correspond to the hardworking patriotism, Western culture that corresponds to the far right, as well as those who like to retire early?
Okay, I mean, good questions. I mean, they have both big historical theoretical implications as well as very concrete in these two very specific movements that you're both focusing on, the Proud Boys and people who want to retire earlier. And in a sense are, but that is what's good, that you're good to be making the point that each of your groups, your advocate groups, your activists on this in their social media sites, they're using American values to justify their specific variation of American values. And that's a good point to make as we do this internationally, or as we do this going from one issue to another. And that is, they don't justify it based on being from the New England region or from the West or something of that sort, or based on being rich or poor or being white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or something like that. That is it. These are, and that's Lipset's general point about American exceptionalism, is that the US is a country that is founded on an ideology. And one could argue, I mean, reasonably, he didn't go into this in detail, but he could say, so is contemporary China. The contemporary China, that is a huge revolution, was to bring Marxism to China. Before Mao, was there Marxism? Minimally. So in that sense, communism brought the West, as well as Marx, as well as Mao, to the leadership and to transform China from a much more traditional society than the US had been or Europe had been, very, very, very rapidly. And so in that sense, you have both aspects of pre-communist Chinese traditionalism, but we have a long enough history from 1945, 46, 47 of Mao and communist related, I mean, the biggest being, of course, the battles with Chiang Kai-shek, the Long March, then the Cultural Revolution at the beginning, and then the sense that it's going too far, and then the return to, and then the rise of a more private sector, entrepreneurial egalitarianism, with social media and all kinds of things. And then, if you will, within the economy now, consumption. Okay, so if we take the Chinese consumption as one of your topics, and the focus not on non-work, and the point which we've had well, yeah, Jean-Tao, you want to mention your topic just in a word for the others?
Okay, so my topic is about Chinese work ethic in the construction. So it's kind of like I want to theorize the Chinese state apparatus, both during the communist era and today's China has contributed a lot to kind of like in the official propaganda and censorship to promote that kind of work ethics, to bring that into the existence, like in a way similar to what the Puritan ethics did for the West. So that's one point. The other point is like on the contemporary issue of the 996, like 996 debate, people also are discussing that, like hardworking spirit, like in Chinese is 奋斗. So it's kind of like, I feel like they're kind of interrelated. So my thesis is like trying to handle both a historical and a contemporary discussion of Chinese, like the so-called the Chinese traditional work ethics, like how did it come about? Yeah.
That's perfect. Let me tell you about one individual. We're going from very general of Calvinism, ideology, down to work. Now let's go down to one person, one Chinese student who grew up in China, who came here just for graduate school. He was in the MAPS program, as several of you are, and he and I were talking about his being a teaching assistant in a course I was starting to teach. And then COVID came in, and he said, "I'm sorry, I cannot stand to be away from China with this disaster occurring in my country. I want to go back." And this was probably February, March of 2020. So COVID was, Wuhan was being isolated, quarantined from the rest of China, and so there was a sense of potential major implications that this could be global. But his concern was patriotic. He wanted to help other fellow Chinese, especially people who were quarantined in Wuhan. He wanted to be able to do things. And so he went back, he stopped being TA, he stopped his MAPS program. He went back to send and mail and to help distribute bandages and masks and food and take people's temperature. Okay, he was not a peasant. He was not a communist. I don't know what is specific. I mean, I never talked about, Communist Party membership or not, but clearly he was strongly driven to do good works in a very Calvinist way. Was he paid for this? Not that I know of. Was he part of the state? Maybe in a loose way, but he was mainly concerned to help patriotically, to help other Chinese who were suffering. And there are many, and we did a book, Megan Calvin and I did a book sponsored by the Ministry of Culture in China and the Ministry of I think it's Economic Development. That is, they wanted us to look at the work of nonprofits. That's the Western term. In China, they're called social groups or social organizations. And they do things like send masks to people in Wuhan. They may not be part of the government. There are many things like, so in the West, there are things like CARE or the Red Cross, that are civic organizations that do good work. They may get money from the state to partially subsidize, but they're not political. They're not political party programs. But more important, he was not a peasant. He was highly educated, and he didn't want to go home and drink and smoke cigarettes and be lazy. He wanted to be at the University of Chicago and finish his MA. but he chose, he felt this was a higher calling on his ethical scale. And in that sense, it was both work and doing good works, maybe even better works than getting his own MA. How does that fit with your interpretation of China today? Or with the conception of retiring or not working that Taylor is invoking? Taylor, was he quitting or was he continuing working by doing morally good works, ideologically good works, even if he wasn't paid or he was paid minimally, maybe later on? So let me turn to you two.
Yeah.
So both of you have spoken, that is, I'm having you speak up because you're dealing with the same general issue in two very different contexts, and they don't fit your little narrow review of the literature. But they do fit when you talk to people. So Taylor, you've talked to us when, as soon as you'd read about Max Weber, you said, oh, of course, there are lots of people that I see in this website. They're talking about charity, helping people, doing good works, and the like. So clearly that this is big. It's not just Chinese. It's not just American. It's not just Calvinist. It's not really a specific Calvinist issue in China at all. How can we make sense of this? I'll ask you too. What have you read in any of the sections of the course that we might build on that would help address, and anybody can help them. Anybody else is free to speak, but I'm turning to these two first because they're thinking about this day and night right now. But anybody else, I mean, this is an issue for all of you. Why are you here and not passing out masks in Wuhan? Okay, because I'm talking to people in Wuhan. They're some of our most active collaborators, and I talked with them last Saturday night for 3 hours.
Yeah, I can kind of talk to that. Like first, individual diversity is a big issue here. Like for sure, every individual is different, and I kind of, with my own personal bias, focus on the really general aspect, and I'm interested in history. So I'm always curious, like how, if I know this person, I would ask like where did you learn that? Like is there any place you can identify? Like when you first feel your passion for your country, it's kind of like where did that begin? It's kind of a really interesting issue for me to discover in the future, because that might be come from the family, that might come from the school, that might come from his friend, his or her friend, like in one daily encountering, or maybe he or she has a close friend or relative living in Wuhan. It's just a lot of reasons might contribute to that. But like for my own interest, I'm more kind of I like look at his history, like as you said, like something which is so much similar to Calvinist like a sentiment. How, and also kind of different, like how did that become like into a being in China? How does the sense of the bigger community? I don't think the Chinese people or any racial and ethnic group in the world is like they are born with that sentiment. I don't think so. It's like there must be some kind of historical, social construction of it. So yeah, I'm more interested at that aspect if I deal with this question.
Okay, well, that's a good formulation, but you've left it as a question. Have you not read any or heard or talked about in this course or anywhere else some answers? This is to you and to Taylor both.
Well, I also just want to, it's another question, but I think it's worth asking, like, how does an individual define a good work as well? Because it's easy to say like doing charity work is a good work. But some people view their engagement in business as a form of ethical contribution. And so I feel like for a lot of the people that I talk to, they have very different definitions of what's like a moral contribution to culture. Yeah.
No, but that's a very important point, which can, in a sense, say, don't focus too narrowly or religiously, especially, or even on charity to define good work. So the student I'm mentioning went back, and so he's helping any way he can with COVID. And in that sense, people can be in business, such as Bill Gates, transformed American business dramatically. And then in the middle senior a little bit in his career, he gave up Microsoft and completely and moved to, or let me just stop there for a second. Why do I mention Bill Gates and Microsoft as important in business in this respect? Anybody know a little bit about what he did at Microsoft and how the Fortune 500 corporations followed Microsoft? Do you have a sense of that? Anybody?
Didn't he eradicate a form of a hierarchy in the employees?
Yes. Now, elaborate a little bit.
I only know the broad strokes about that, but I think he tried to reduce the sense of competition but amongst them.
There could still be competition, but it was a friendly, collegial competition. But the sense that business is a hierarchy and you follow the boss like a military organization was what he destroyed, or he tried to destroy. And what's critical is not only did he do this successfully at Microsoft, of telling people, you're basically programmers in background. You're the creative people, not me. We have 5 things we might work on. Who wants to work on each of these 5? Then they'd divide up and they'd join different subgroups, then they'd work together. He'd check in with them now, or not just he, but that is, there weren't bosses. The idea was you, the programmers, you're the creative people, and we want to help you do what you can. They could dress any way they wanted. And so they didn't wear bow ties or ties at all. Many would come dressed in their hiking boots with their carabiners. Who knows what a carabiner is? They're little metal things that you use mountain climbing. Hiking boots, carabiners that would jangle as they'd walk through the hall, and mountain climbing clothes some people would wear. Okay, that sense of style, decentralization, abolishing hierarchy, and then having committees or things in human relations within that business that would try to implement these, was adopted about 5 years later by something like 70%, 60-70% of all of the 500 corporations in the United States. This is a revolution against hierarchy inside the corporate structure. And there were surveys that were done by people at Harvard Business School that showed these changes over the years, and the Fortune 500 is published. This stuff is published in Fortune magazine, the Harvard Business Review, and so forth. So my point is, this was similar to the Margaret Thatcher revolution in raising egalitarianism. The good works part, maybe you say this is just another better way to make money, maybe so, but then he retired in his mid-career. And he and his wife, for many years, gave away a lot of their money to people in the poorest countries of the world, doing things, as you know, with COVID and so forth. So he's back to some degree, but he's doing both of these. That is clearly, and then as I've said, the Elazar migration from New England to Washington State is part of classic Calvinist New England values. So in that sense, Elazar fits with corporations, with good works, with the American traditional background. How could this link with the Chinese? That is, how might we make, what might be some of the answers for China that would correspond to Bill Gates or Lipset, or people who left Canada and came here, John Kenneth Galbraith? how can, that is, what are some answers, either thinking of individuals you may know, and I'm citing a case to try to make this more concrete, and to say that good works, I mean, or that, okay. But I'm trying to have anyone else, as we've got several of you from China, it doesn't have to be just be Zhantan Lo. Yiling Lin, you have thoughts on this? How about in Chinese science? Where is there a concept of good work in Chinese science, and how do these ideas, for instance, are programmers and mathematicians treated differently than other people within China as in their work? Is there working, are they more egalitarian? Are programmers more egalitarian? Chinese programmers, do they act in a more egalitarian, anti-state, I shouldn't say anti-state, but anti-hierarchical way than do other workers in China?
Speaking of the hierarchy, I'm kind of thinking when I'm during my internship, and the people with the technical skills, like they can do programming or they know more financial stuff, financial knowledge, they are treated as skilled people and the skilled people with expertise. And this kind of workers is different from, some workers who just know how to do the paperwork, or they spend more of the time in the office hour and talking with people, like the people do the service stuff. So I'm kind of thinking the people with hard skills is more valued in the evaluation system than the people who just have the soft skills. And in speaking of the the INT hierarchy stuff, I just internship in a very big company, and it's e-commerce. Sorry, it's a e-business that like the people buy the stuff from the website, and they are the companies that build the whole system, and also it's a very big company, so it has many different departments. So the department I am in is like more hierarchy stuff, because I'm doing the service things. I connect with the emails from the outside country, and also I deal with the bugs of the systems. So the way I'm treated is more like I'm just a worker there. I'm just a part of a whole system, and so there is not enough space for me to feel like I have so much values of myself, of my skills. But for the people, in another system that like the people who do the programming, the structure of them is more loose than the people who do the service work. And I have visited their office, and it seems like they can discuss the technical details freely in their office. And because I noticed this, because it's very often for the workers to spend to work overtime in the big companies. So at that situations, there's no big difference for the leaders with the workers, because they all have to work together to push their project forwards. So I'm kind of thinking the hard skilled person is more treated equally in the system evaluation.
Okay, I mean, that's an excellent example. Does this link with anything we've read about, say, from Durkheim?
I'm not sure. Yeah, could you give me some sign or some connections?
Three terms as connections. Mechanical solidarity is the small town traditional family hierarchy. Organic solidarity is what you can get in a big city. But how does how can you maintain patriotism, or the French or the Chinese nation, when you have programmers as well as peasants as well as others? And the more specific concept was what Durkheim called corporatism, but today we could call professionalism. And so the professionalism of the computer programmers, they correct each other. That is, if one programmer makes a mistake, the others will catch it and they will help make the program work. So they're using their technical skills, which at least in your office, you did not have. So you were being treated in a more hierarchical manner because you're keeping the organization going and following the organizational, you have outside invitations for work, whereas the programmers have their professional organization as a mechanism for supervising them, so they don't need to have a Bill Gates at the top telling them this is how you should write the program, or here's your mistake in the program. Bill Gates should not have to make those corrections. He should rely on the programmers to fix their own errors. So what you're describing is excellent. It's contemporary. It's in a corporation right now. Instead of saying capitalism is corporations and corporations are all hierarchy, on the contrary, they change. The culture of corporations changes just as the culture of government agencies change. And so another big government example is, I'll just introduce to make the general point about capitalism and government and so forth. France is the Western country that has classically the strongest government and is proud. French citizens are proud of their government the way that the Chinese are. That it's the classic Western strong state from Louis XIV and Versailles up to present, almost to present. After 1968, within France, you had the student revolts and some union and worker revolts who were saying, we have too much arrogance. That term was frequently used. It's the same word in French. And we have l'arrogance. We have too much arrogance in our political leaders and our administrative and our government leaders. We should change this. And one of the people who said this in a book was Michel Crozier, Crozier. He was the leading French organization theorist. And he basically said, we need to change French culture. The problem is the French cultural style, reinforced by the meritocratic system of examinations and getting into more and more elite schools, is that the people who get in at the very top and who want to go into government, finally, after going to one school after the other, they go to one called the ENA, the École Nationale d'Administration, the National Administration School. And so he wrote a book in which he said, we should abolish the ENA. The ENA is perpetuating these hierarchical values. I told you before that the University of Chicago Laboratory School was a world leader in progressive education, and you had people from Paris who said the same thing. We must change French values from the lycées onward, and we're going to start 2 of these lycées here in Paris to try to change the value. Okay, so Crozier said the same thing at the ENA level, but that was maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. I was at a conference where he and I were the 2 main speakers, and I was talking about the new political culture, that this is a general cultural style. And he was specifically talking about France and the ENA, but they were the same basic argument that the new political culture matched what he was saying about France administratively. Or in terms of your example, these are the programmers instead of the hierarchical people in the top-down administration. And so the state, the general point here is the state does not have to be hierarchical. How can you make a state less hierarchical? I've worked a lot with mayors and with government officials who ask these questions. How can states be made less hierarchical? Think of France or China or even the US.
Professor, I had a question. So in my understanding that, taking China as an example, sometimes what is the price when you try to anti-hierarchy, social hierarchy in China. So sometimes it seems like that you're try to go against the hierarchy, go against such structural violence, but you are actually anti the government. So what price that people may pay in order to anti the so-called hierarchy? Because like, I mean, like there are many like lawyers, especially human rights lawyers who work for those people, but most of them like do not have a very good ending. They are in jail right now. I don't know that like real date, like, but I know many of them are actually in jail for those like, I mean, those human rights lawyers. So what kind of price that you may pay in order to for such equality in our society? Just like example that Ely mentioned, like programmers or those technique based like employees are prioritized in many corporations because such kind of position are valued by the country in order to boost the economy. So if you try to go against with such hierarchy, you're actually go against with the government. So you may pay a lot of price, even your life. I'm not sure about that.
Well, this is true everywhere. That is, it may be stronger. You may have more censorship in a tougher state in this example in China, but you have conflicts in France, in England, in the US. I mean, the Proud Boys are obviously super conflictual and fighting is going on. It may be that people are not shooting at them, but there can be plenty of conflict and disagreement over what is the right or the wrong way to implement more egalitarianism or to do good, or what is a good work. Clearly, people will be arguing about this for longer than all of our lives. What is good? What is a good work, or what? But in the simple, I think probably others who know China better than I, or we can imagine some other examples. That is, your answer came in part to my question: how can we change the state to be less hierarchical? And you made the point that it may be that the people some that you're mentioning in the human rights area, they may be against the state, but do they really want to? If they really wanted to just dynamite the state, this is what the Red Brigades did in Germany and in Italy. They just killed people. The human rights people are not doing simply that. I mean, they want to, don't they want to have more sensitive attention to various forms of human rights? So I'm not really disagreeing with you. I'm simply trying to say there are many different issue areas that governments in China and in France or elsewhere deal with different issues, whether it's programming and having the government use that programming, having the military use that programming, having business use that programming. But that programming style tends to be more egalitarian as a work pattern generally. If you're dealing with, say, with feminism within China, clearly there are many traditions which reinforce a patriarchal, traditional, hierarchical pattern. And it may be that sometimes these are supported and other times these are opposed by different state agencies. Or in another example, in the book on the third sector, we have one of the biggest cases is an example. And so here okay, let me, I don't want to answer my own question. I can think of an example I can cite. If you've even read that one, you can bring it in. But can anyone else give us an example how the state, which can be the Communist Party propaganda committee, it can be the president, it can be journalists who are talking about how, or Michel Crozier, who's an organizational. So what the government did in this 20 years ago, the government at the time said, this is an important book, let's talk about it. And the government, the National French government said to Michel Crozier, you can be the consultant / director of 2 ministries of the French government, of the national government. And so he was empowered. And so they said, why don't you try out your ideas? Make these departments less hierarchical. Show us how to do it. So so the French were talking about it, and I'm sure the Chinese are talking about this in different ways as well today. But who could give an example beyond the one that I'm giving to you now, that is of seeing culture is changing and changeable? And how might there be examples in China? Just maybe think of another, this ought to be a simple question for all of you, but I'm trying to have you actively see how culture can be consciously changed, building on and extending these in part because when Mao was having trouble, I guess, I won't say trouble, but you're seeing this as an anti-state, and you're seeing it as so profoundly anti-state that it's not just a change, it is you're saying in a sense, you're destroying the state. And I'm suggesting, think more like a president or, or a mayor. And as I've spent hundreds of hours working with mayors, and I see them looking for doing things like this. So who else could give us an example, either from, ideally from government, to complement the Bill Gates revolution in the corporate area?
I don't know if it corresponds directly, and it's from a reading from another class, so I don't know if it'll correspond to anyone's work, but Robert Putnam had his book in 1993 about local governments in Italy might correspond to a cultural change, because in, I think, the 70s, legislation was passed that granted more powers to regional governments, and then I think he traces their effectiveness to historical factors and civic associationism. But the idea is that in many regions of Italy, this concession of power built more of a local political dynamic. So perhaps that could be seen as a political cultural change.
Excellent, powerful example, very, very powerfully documented in the book by Putnam, which is widely used and widely read inside Italy as well as outside, even if people are arguing over it. I mean, it's critical. You could say it's critical of the Italian national state. In that sense, it fits with when Mao's of saying these human rights lawyers are treated poorly, they may end up in jail. The same thing, in southern Italy, they can be killed. There are a lot of people who get murdered. Mafia has been doing this for centuries. And that this is still the classic way that the mafia deals with the people they disagree with. They kill them. And so one thing that's happened is that they have many trials and court sessions, even on television, so that you can see the judge and the mafia person who's being accused, and then people who are witnesses and others who testify. So Italy is dealing with these in its domestic politics on a daily basis of transforming. So I'll give one example. If I've talked to Italian professors and been in their office, and they might say, "Oh, apologies, the garbage hasn't been picked up for the last few months, and so we've had a strike with the workers who do that." And I said, "Oh, really? Are they from Milan here or from Florence?" "Oh no, they're hired from the South. They're patronage clientelist appointees through their party and their personal relations. They come from Salerno, they come from Naples and South. And so they then get jobs through the national government and its party to pick up the garbage in a northern Italian city university. So in that sense, one could delegate the responsibility from the national government to the city of Milan. And so this is the kind of thing that Putnam talks about, that you get big regional differences that people fight over in terms of, say, the same thing. So some of the big, okay, I don't want to go on too much with the examples, but there are many things like this. And that just to tick off one or two other big factors. At the time of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the U.S., this was also Ronald Reagan. Have to throw this in. What brought Ronald Reagan to power? The Republican Party. He was a Republican, but he was governor of the state of California. He was very successful in California as governor, very popular as a national figure. He did sort of speeches around the country. He transformed, or he tried to transform, American government. And his counterpart in England was Margaret Thatcher, who I've talked to you about. Both of them were leading examples. However, I would say, unlike Margaret Thatcher, in the parliamentary system, she got a majority of the Conservative Party votes, but not of the popular vote. Reagan did. Reagan was very popular with the American citizens. And one difference was that, and an illustration was, the taxpayers' revolt. This is one of the big themes in my book called City Money. The taxpayers' revolt was not Ronald. That is, many people who say that Reagan created conservatism in America and cut government. You hear that very widely. And Margaret Thatcher did the same. Okay. First it's false. In fact, government kept growing under both of them. They didn't have enough votes with their Congresses and their House of Parliament to implement these programs. But two, if we go back causally, what was the causal cultural driver? The answer was, in 1974, 6 years before the election of Ronald Reagan, the majority, just more than 51% of American cities, local governments across the US, who were a majority of all of them, and then a majority of those with Democratic parties, started cutting their budgets. And they got money from Washington, so people didn't realize that the local governments were cutting their local tax-based revenues. I showed this in the book and started giving speeches in 1974, 75, 76, and people threw tomatoes at me, eggs. They said, "You're stupid, this is wrong, we have no, how can you be saying this?" And then came Proposition 13 in California, and then 2 years later in Michigan and Massachusetts. And then after all of that, Ronald Reagan was elected. Ronald Reagan was a consequence, not a cause, of the taxpayers' revolt. Okay, so in that sense, he was the opposite of the Margaret Thatcher kind of Conservative Party battle, where that was an elite battle within the political leadership. Ronald Reagan, in that sense, was more populist. In that sense, he fits with the conception that Lipset talked about of populism as being a more basic American value, not coming, and then he, in turn, I'll just mention a couple of examples. Other people then, or that is, the people who were doing this innovatively were not in Washington. They were mayors. And I've worked for, and I've studied mayors in part for that reason, because you can find more, you can better understand countries and bigger questions if you have lots of cases. So you have some cities that do this, others that don't. Some countries that do this, some that don't. So you can see how much is it based on income or gender or party and so forth. And it's often none of those, it's other things. And so you can see this by having individual cases, such as I'm talking to you about programmers. And I learned about Chinese programmers because I read an MA from a student who wrote exactly, and what they said were exactly what what Yi Ling talked about. I've read that story in 50 pages about China before. Okay, so my simple point is we can see these things if we look at some variations, and we then in the project was then called Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation. Both were cultural challenges. And fiscal austerity came at the time of the taxpayers' revolt. Does that lead to innovation like the programming, and where and why we've been studying for 3 decades, basically. We published more than 50 books with people in 35 countries, including China, France, and so forth. So I've learned a lot through that. And the taxpayers' revolt, I'm contrasting the way it worked out in Italy, France, the US, and China, because these were different patterns. But we did have a list of about, I think we had 32 policies. And just to mention, and these were for cities or governments to do. And they included at the top the simple things: cut taxes. Second, cut staff. Did the Chinese ever cut staff? Let me ask our Chinese here. How was the taxpayers' revolt, which in the West was championed by Reagan and Thatcher, implemented in China? I'm not surprised. I asked this of Chinese students. I'm amazed that the Chinese students don't know this. 1/3 of the national government, the state, the big state, 1/3 of the staff was fired. The Chinese went much further, much faster, much more vigorously in the years when Reagan and Thatcher gave big speeches on cutting government, that they did not cut government anywhere near as much as the Chinese. However, 2 or 3 years later, the Chinese national government said, this has worked. We're cutting government, we're still delivering services, it's working efficiently. We will now do the same thing for our provincial and our local governments in China. And then what happened? Nothing. The local and provincial governments disagreed with the national government, and they didn't fire people, which illustrates there's a little bit of federalism even. And so that's why so the Western press talks about how the president of China is totalitarian. He can't control, I won't talk about him in detail. I'm making the point that in the past, when this effort by the national government to ask the local governments to fire 1/3 of their staff, no. And this is silent enough a piece of Chinese history that none of you Chinese can tell me about it. Read, I'm sure you'll find it if you look it up, but it's China in that sense is very, very different from Thatcher and Reagan today. Okay, let's take a break. We'll come back in 15 minutes and continue with the next section. 6:04 for my time. So. Any quick follow-up just to connect with what I said about, let me just quickly add, say for Wen Mao, her question of how can we join the human rights lawyers with the firing? The classic left and the classic right does not answer our question. The classic left says we must do good things. We must give people more rights. We must give them swimming pools. We must help them with medical supplies and so forth. Good things that many people, the majority of people like. The majority of people also would like lower taxes. And the ethnic group that is most in favor of lower taxes in the United States is African Americans. Right in my Bronzeville neighborhood, people hate government taxes and so forth. How can we put these two together? This is what we'll read about next week in something called the new political culture. That is, the traditional left and traditional right are fiscally conservative and socially conservative, and they go together. But the parties are changing and they're combining these in different ways. So so Reagan and Thatcher were both traditional conservatives, generally. The revolution came with Tony Blair in England and Bill Clinton in the US, and they were fiscally conservative. Tony Blair took power when he pledged to follow Margaret Thatcher's fiscal program. But if I think for you not to change spending for something like 4 or 5 years, but then he had a strong socially progressive program, crime, delinquency, so forth, many other problems. And after 4 years, he started more actively spending, but he was doing those from the beginning if they didn't cost money. So my point is, you can give more human rights. You can do both human rights and be fiscally conservative, and that's called the new political culture. And the majority of citizens in Western Europe and Japan support fiscal conservatism on taxes, but they want more good things, which may not just physical things like swimming pools, but also human rights. The majority of French citizens are not opposed to immigrants. That is, the National Front did not win power. Macron won, and Macron's whole party is moving in this direction. So Macron, I mean, each of these individuals have unique specifics about them, but the general idea of Macron is young. He has a wife who's teaching him about the arts. And he went to this ENA, but he abolished the EMA, which was the major policy of Crozier to reduce the arrogance of French culture. Okay, so he's trying. So in that sense, remember, we are beyond the traditional left and right, and we have many different combinations especially from Bill Clinton, Tony Blair onward, and now we got people reacting against them. And that's the topic of the Proud Boys. So the Proud Boys are anti-Hillary Clinton, anti-Tony Blair, and as was Trump. So in that respect, we have all these things going on and so it's great. And to have many different social media sites is a great way to do research. And so you're smart to be focusing on these, but don't go back to China, Gento, and just use the National Communist Party statements. Remember, 1/3 of those people were fired and the local officials were not. That's a Chinese element of federalism, which was more strongly followed in policy than was followed in the so-called federalist country of Ronald Reagan. Wild. And none of you have ever heard of this. Okay, look it up and do a paper. It's worth the topic. Okay, we'll talk more about some of the new political culture, but let's go on now with couple of big themes. Howard Becker. Art Worlds. It's an ironic book in that the title, you look at the first word art, and you think, oh, this is about painting and elegance. But look at who's on the cover. Who's doing the work? A man in the background is carrying the painting. Let me get his face big enough so you can see. He's looking down with a sort of sneer at this high culture stuff. He's a real man. He's a worker. He carries paintings. He doesn't paint them. Okay. Becker comes from the tradition of the sociology of work done at Chicago, which is to sort of, Everett Hughes was the major force before Howard Becker. And they basically say work is work is work. I'm simplifying, but if you can retire at 35, that's great. They have a somewhat alienated conception of work, as is in the facial expression of the man on the cover of the painting, not of the book, with the painting and the man's face. Okay. Nevertheless, even though that's if you will, his underlying theme. He has enough. He's also. It is also a monograph / textbook for art, and so it starts with the Renaissance in terms of Western art. It's got a little bit, but it's mostly Western art, and Western art really began with the Renaissance in Italy. And so what he does is to link and to deal in different chapters with different themes about the rise of the arts and how this is changing how we think more generally, and changing culture, and culture in both senses. And one big theme was innovation. And the Renaissance was the rebirth. Renaissance in English and French and Italian means rebirth, the rediscovery of what? The Greeks and the Israelites. That is to go beyond the Middle Ages dominated by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was still critical then, but the Catholic Church was saying, you know, we want to have more popular support with the people. People like to come to big Gothic churches. They like paintings. They like sculpture. We'll commission artists to do more paintings and sculpture in beautiful churches. And the Italians did this best and first, paid by usually the church, individual bishops and people. And so there was competition among branches of the church for getting the support of different Italian artists. The King of France at the time was named Francis I. Proud to have the name of the country in his own name, Francis I. And he was furious that France was second. France did not have these Italian paintings. They didn't have these churches. And the Italians really were developing the Renaissance. So first he tried to hire them away. He tried to hire away some of the Renaissance painters to come to France. He failed with most, but he did get the top guy, Leonardo da Vinci. He became the artist of the king, and he brought with him the Mona Lisa, which is why that painting is in the French museum, the Louvre, not in Italy, where it belongs historically, if you will. And he stayed, but he couldn't hire anybody else. So he invaded Italy 2 or 3 times militarily. He occupied Milan. He invaded Naples and so forth. He lost in Naples. He almost got killed himself in Naples. Then what the French did in answer was what? The chateaus of the Loire, many beautiful castles, couple of hundred of them, built by the king, by the king for his wife, by the king for 2 different mistresses that each have separate castles, and so forth and so forth. And social life surrounding that. Then that came to Fontainebleau, and it came to Versailles and the Louvre. So those were these were the locations of the royal court in those years. The French-Italian competition was critical, but where and why did the art get done? Who did this good art and why? This was written about by the artists and by others. And some of the artists began to talk about, we need to have more freedom, like Chinese programmers. And so the artists said, we need to be able to have long hair or live together or recognize that there's talent and creativity in each painting, even if you don't recognize it very much. So this wasn't that dramatic as I'm slightly overstating. I'm giving you the beginnings of the idea of creativity were clearly critical in the painters. Flash forward to the novel. So when the print became a mass topic and the King of France was guillotined, we had markets for books, and novels were selling, and the most famous best-selling novelist was Balzac, And Balzac developed the idea of bohemia, and that artists should be able to live together in a separate section, and they did. So they lived in a region called Montmartre, part of Paris. And they could have free love. They could argue against the family. They could, they could dress any way they want, and so forth. And they stayed in their neighborhood, and they reinforced the idea of having a bohemian, distinctive, artistic lifestyle that was not bourgeois. Okay, middle class, proper, politically correct. All right, so that in turn led to Baudelaire, who we saw, the poet who inspired the Arcade Project earlier on. I'm just linking the pieces together here of creativity. Cities, neighborhoods can be creative, and culture can be changing and creative if you have people doing it and writing about it, like Proust and Balzac and Stendhal and Rossini. Okay. Becker contrasts the tradition of creativity of the individual artist with, and he mentions a little bit the market, that's a little really in a later section, but the main thing that he talks about in this book is work as patronage. This fits more Chicago politics when he was around here, and much of the work around the world today. Work is treated as working for a boss, and if you're in a Chicago, you work for the Chicago Park District, classic area of patronage in Chicago. You got your job because you and your husband and your son all worked in the political campaign of X, and because they got X elected, and he's now in the city council, you get a job working for the Chicago Park District. And that happened for 50 years in Chicago. Park District was the leading patronage ground. Patronage also is how art dealers, especially, would support painters. And you would have painters, even if the painting were not yet sold, nobody was ready to buy it, it wasn't even done, that the Parisian painters had a style of working for, or I should start with earlier, the king. Molière wrote his plays for the King of France, just as Shakespeare did for Queen Elizabeth. So the royal courts tended to be major places where the high arts were created in that sense. With the rise of markets in the 19th century, the same idea was beginning to be applied, say, to novels. For Balzac's books, Dickens's books were bestsellers. But within these domains, you could still have, as we saw a little bit in Bourdieu, a patronage hierarchical publishing house or government agency which gave grants to certain artists and not to others, like the Ministry of Culture under de Gaulle, and continuing, or to Crozier. I said Crozier was given in that sense, he got patronage. I would say it was more for his good ideas, but he had a lot of personal connections as well. So patronage in the classic way that patronage is still the main political culture of the world, whether it's in Turkey or Afghanistan or in Chicago or in Beijing. There's a lot of personal relations. Trump was the most visible recent example, bringing in his own family to the White House, having all the media, everybody in Congress, all the civic leaders say, this is immoral, it's irresponsible, you can't do this, you're violating all, and he kept on doing it. Okay, so in that sense, clientelism and family, and then say, oh no, I'm not going to sell my golf courses and all my businesses. And so in that sense, Trump's violation of these kinds of rules of separation of authority and responsibility illustrate the degree to which an exception, a deviant, shows the strength of the main rules. And of course, when he tried to stay on, against the rules. He got bumped off of Facebook, etc. Okay, so this, my point is not about Trump. My point is clientelism is still a major rationale, and it came in Chicago. It was refined and honed in Chicago and nationally in the U.S. The people who did this best were which ethnic group? The Irish Catholics. Okay, and we had a paper on this. So Becker, I'm pushing on now to white and white. This is this is basically a discussion of the rise of the market. So Harrison White is trained as a physicist, PhD from Princeton, was professor at Harvard for 20, 30 years, and he was at Columbia, still is, and his first wife was in French art history, and they did this splendid book on canvases and careers, chapter 1, focal reading. And basically it's how the Impressionists, probably the best known single group of artists in the world ever, became so popular, even though they were rejected when they tried to rise through the official state organization. That is, they were not chosen by the state and were not given prizes. They went outside and there was the official art, like the Chinese. If we were in China, we could say the cultural policy of the French state was different from what individual artists were doing. And so in China today, some of the most openly critical people of the Chinese state are artists, and they come to Europe, they come to the US, they make statements to the New York Times about how oppressive it is to be in China and so forth. But then they keep on painting. Okay, so in the same way, Becker summarizes what the whites do in their book, of saying part of this was due to the rise of the market. And as you had people collecting more and more paintings, sculpture, and people with less money could buy novels and read them, you then had the intermediary of the art dealers and art houses, art auctioneers. And these now are major things going on in China, in New York and London, where they auction off the most valuable pieces of art. Who were the people who, so Paris, Milan, London were the centers of art in the 20th century. At the end of the century, say after World War II, it was New York. New York became the center. So artists would take their work to New York or to New York art dealers and then auction or sell it in galleries in New York. Who were the major buyers of these paintings and art objects today in the 21st century? The richest capitalists in this country with the most inequality of income? The English with their entrepreneurial Margaret Thatcher, who was there, and it's the most free market country in Europe. No. Who buys most of this art? The Chinese. The Chinese are the biggest buyers and the biggest actors in setting the prices of art in the world today. And initially they bought Chinese art, but they're now the major buyers of all kinds of art from all around the world. So markets can deeply penetrate China. Which occupation, following the Becker art world's inequality, occupational, the Marxian theme, where do we have more income inequality and occupational inequality? Which type of occupation has I won't say the only, but one of the highest levels of inequality? Is it computer programmers? No. Is it college professors? No. It's artists. Novelists and artists, painters, tend to have a very, very, very small, super elite, highly, highly paid, and people further down are paid less than graduate students at the University of Chicago, and you're suffering. Okay. People who are people who get paid welfare checks because they're the poorest people in America get paid more than artists, than some of the artists. Okay, so the inequality in the arts is very, very strong, and much debated about and discussed, and there's a whole lot of ideological difference. I'll then add a next step which goes beyond the art world book, but continuing the kinds of historical transformations of where and how is art exchanged, and where and how do people have where and how do artists have a relationship to what we just finished talking about and still are, politics and political leadership. What's the big change? Anybody have an art history or an art course or contemporary art, or anybody have just some knowledge of this stuff? I went to a faculty seminar on this about a year ago, met with mainly people. I was one of two social scientists, or mostly people from the art history department, classics department. Visual arts is it's sort of media, movie studies and so forth at the USC, and a couple of painters like Theaster Gates. Sculptor, he's really a sculptor, but also does painting and singing and so forth. The change comes from the artists, as with Balzac and Baudelaire. But today, the revolution is called public art. That artists don't want to just sell to the rich Chinese. They want to go out in the streets of Paris or Chicago or Des Moines, Iowa, and spread their art locally. And in some cities in southern Italy, the local governments even pay artists to help mobilize a small minority group like human rights in China or feminists in China. They will be sponsored by a small town in southern Italy to help mobilize women in southern Italy be more active by using the arts to bring out the themes of oppressed feminism or non-feminism. And in that way, they politicize through the arts social issues in ways that are explicitly controversial and part of the political system. So it's analogous to what you're talking about, Wen-Mao, and it's risky because this is the area of the world where the mafia is still busy. They murder people. In Germany, they do the same thing, and we had 60 papers on this stuff at a meeting of the International Sociological Society. 60 papers that dealt with sort of public art in ways that this is going on around the world. So that's where I learned of these examples just a few years ago. The German cities do the same, but they don't pay. So the artists are mobilizing, or they're trying to mobilize citizens, but the government says if we paid the artists, we could be accused of taking sides, and they could be accused of being corrupted by the government. Therefore, we will let them do it, and we will let their art be posted on flyers or on the media or on posters in the streets or whatever else. But in that way, then we had things like well, let's say Bill Clinton playing his own music in the White House, Barack Obama and Mrs. Obama dancing and being televised, that is used, and then both of them going to Hollywood to raise money and to have television coverage of them with the artists. Just an example, it's not just Hollywood in the West. I read a great BA on it was either Jamaica or another one of the islands. No, it wasn't Jamaica. It was, and I'm blocking on the name of which island it was, where the political leaders feel that they're inferior. The same thing is true in America, which is why I'm choosing a non-American case. But the political leaders feel they're not as important and not as much appreciated by average citizens on the island as are the calypso singers. So there's great efforts by political leaders to buy off some calypso singers to endorse the political candidate for office and to sing a song when they make videos about why you should vote for me, and then they'll have the calypso singer singing and illustrating this. And the woman who wrote it had a father who was herself, I think he was a member of, I can't remember if he was a calypso singer or he was a politician, but she knew it very well from having grown up and wrote about it in a brilliant BA right here. Okay, so my point is, and I mentioned just one more, well, Versailles, the arts, the Italian Renaissance, and they're like Notre Dame. These are massive, the Chateaux de Loire. These are massive examples of using art to commemorate military victory, to try to legitimate the political leadership, to say Napoleon was a great man because he brought the metric system to messy Germany and Russia and so forth. And as I said, Hegel, who was talking about theory and abstract rationality, said, oh yes, Napoleon is who we really want. Beethoven. Okay, so legitimacy is important, and it's a cultural key element that Gertz talked about, and how the elites of Indonesia in the 19th century used funerals, used the royal progress in Morocco. The Queen Elizabeth from the first to today are still doing royal progresses. Okay, so and this is the Western counterpart of Chinese cultural policy, especially from Mao onward, but it was there earlier, of course, for centuries in China. China has a much longer much longer art tradition than do the European countries, long before Leonardo da Vinci, etc. Okay, so I'm going through themes. These are the big classic themes of the era. Okay, next reading, I'll just jump right ahead and not try to make a transition. Ann Swidler was a PhD student at Harvard with Parsons. And like you, she said, Parsons is hard to read. I don't like this stuff. And she said, I'm going to ignore what Parsons said about the interpenetration of these 5 dimensions of the theory of action. I'm going to instead say what we need for culture and cultural analysis is a cultural toolbox. She took a view more like the guy carrying the painting on the cover of Becker. And so she said, the cultural toolbox can include certain kinds of norms that you should do this or not do that, and things that she would suggest we focus on. But we should not follow Parsons. We should not look for basic values. We should not look for Durkheim or Weber's conception of the Protestant ethic. Throw that all out. This is the revolution in the American version of after post 68. Throw out the forefathers. Follow me, the young revolutionaries of 68. So she got a job at the center of the revolution in Berkeley, and then at Stanford, and then Berkeley. And I'll just leave it briefly at that. She in turn was criticized. This whole idea of the cultural toolbox was deeply criticized by the leading African-American professor at Harvard, Orlando Patterson, before Bill Wilson was there, I think, about the same time. And Patterson said, what you're doing, Anne, is illustrating exactly what Parsons criticized in the Structure Social Action in 1937 as the utilitarian dilemma. That is, you're doing what Jeremy Bentham and the British tradition of utilitarian theory, which is still found in part in the older economics and the older psychology. You're leaving out where do preferences come from? That preferences is the economic term. Where do values come? Who wants to have good works? Why does the Chinese map student go back to China? Because he wants to help people suffering from COVID. What's in his heart that leads him to leave his career at the University of Chicago, his scholarship, everything, to go back and do something else? That's a more basic value, which is not explained by the normal utilitarian approach. And so what newer economists are now doing is to study more generally utility, and they use data on happiness. So they look at surveys in ways that economists did not do 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever. So there's a very clear paper on this, which is on the syllabus by Stephen Vaisey, V-A-I-S-E-Y. And the title doesn't tell you this, but it deals with exactly with what's wrong with Swidler and how can the criticism from Parsons and Patterson be applied in the study of poverty and the culture of poverty in educational attainment, which are classic sort of economic so-called topics. But he's showing how we can use how we need. He's illustrating the point of Parsons that we need all 5 of these things. That if you leave out values, you leave out norms, you only look at means ends trying to maximize your utility, you get a misleading result. So he does it both conceptually and then statistically with data on poverty and what helps some poor people get, I won't say out of poverty, but rise in income and others go down, and how do these patterns change? So that's the best analytical answer of the cultural toolbox. I'll just add one more piece, which is that when Ann Swidler came to the USC here about 2 or 3 years ago, she gave a talk on her new work, and she talked about basic values and norms and preferences and actions as all being important. She didn't mention the cultural toolbox. She didn't mention Parsons, but she showed that her own work has learned to do all of these. So she's changed the kind of sociology she's doing and not omitting she's not acting like the 68 revolutionary that she wrote about in the paper that we're reading. Okay. Another big approach to culture is associated with Vanderbilt, especially the lead senior person was Richard Peterson. A couple of others went there, including especially Richard. Here. It's on here. No, maybe it's not on this list. Richard Peterson, Creating Country Music. Okay. Peterson is not from the South. He's a Yankee. He's studying country music and he doesn't really like it very much. He doesn't like the themes, whatever, but he wants to analyze a little bit like the guy writing in the Art World's cover, how it became so popular and was part of the mass society we live in. And he has a neo, I won't say, let's say he wants to privilege the economy and privilege media and privilege money. And he basically says there were music stations, especially in Atlanta, but then across the South, and they would play the music of certain singers and not others, and they would build up the popularity of a small number of country music stars. And in that way, it was the personal preferences, the choices of certain disc jockeys working for the radio stations that in turn was the production side, which explained the popularity of certain country music songs, singers, themes. This, if you will, is this is half of the story if you take the production and the consumption side, but it's only the production side. He says almost nothing about what's in the minds and the hearts of country music fans. Why do people want to listen? Why do they buy records? Why do they go to concerts, mass audiences, and especially the South? Dolly Parton, why is she a star, etc. Truck drivers across America listen to country music. People in the Philippines even learned about country music, and there's a big Filipino country music group as well. Okay. I will simply flag that this is a strong tradition in cultural studies of cultural industries and the production of culture seen as driving the whole system. It's in Marx, but it's not just in Marx. It's an economic production side, a capital advertising Adorno side, rather than the Lazarsfeld side, looking at how much do people listen to and choose the records. And I'll just mention, rather than trying to go through point by point, there's a book by the current chairman of the music department, or he's an ethnomusicologist, so-called, at Columbia, which is where they was really one of the centers of doing this kind of analysis. And it's called music. This is called Creating Country. I think the title is, it's either Country Music or Building Country Music. It's a very similar title. But it's the opposite story of Peterson's. That is, he argues that country music in the past and in the present, and it's an ethnographic study. He went down and spent some time working with people in one small town south of Austin who were mechanics in truck repair shops, people who were working in diners, people who were working in bars, and saw what did they listen to and what did they talk about. And his basic interpretation is that the heroic rise of a particular singer was based on localism. You started in your own town, you'd play in the bar, you'd play, you'd have friends, maybe you went to high school with, they knew you, they'd come to the bar when the night you were playing. And then you'd get a little bit, so it had a more localistic, particularistic set of social content. Then you'd rise, and as you got a little higher, you go to the next town. It's the opposite story of Peterson. Probably they're both there. But Peterson didn't tell us about the local side. And the other guy didn't stress so much the media side. I'll just make the point that one way I won't vary it from that. That's enough of a point there. Last little section is on types of food and then contrasts of patronage. And okay, so at the chef's table, the bigger interesting theme, I would say, or one big simple theme as a takeaway for those of you who are too busy working on your MAs to be able to stop and have food, or only have fast food. When fast food came to Paris and Rome, the people, especially the restaurant owners, but also many French and Italian citizens, said, "This is terrible. This is almost un-French." They didn't say un-French or un-Italian, as Lipset. I'm playing on Lipset. But instead of saying, "We don't want fast food," well, I mean, there are many examples of social movements. Did we talk about? Yeah, no, I was in an earlier class. The Yellow Vests. The Yellow Vests are a sort of an activist movement in France. And at one point, there was I think it was just one guy, when they were having a demonstration, he went out, and during the night, he tore down an entire McDonald's. So the McDonald's was there. The next morning, the McDonald's was gone. The shop, people came to work, their building was gone. And a couple of days later, during the night, he rebuilt it. It was perfect. So I'm making the simple point that fast food was a symbolic social movement icon for some, and an icon to be destroyed for others. There are a couple of books called The McDonaldization of the World and so forth. The Hollywoodization is the same author. Hollywoodization and McDonaldization are two ways of trying to talk about culture and culture change, but which is a slight simplification of Lenin, if you will. That is, it's a capitalist, it's a crude, heavy-handed kind of capitalist interpretation. What did they do in Paris and Rome? Folks created social movements like the Proud Boys. They didn't call them Proud Boys. What did they call their movement? Slow food. And there's even an American slow food website if you want to look it up. So even Americans, maybe before and after age 35 for Taylor, eat slow food or fast food, and they may cook or not cook so much themselves. But these are fighting words, and these, especially in Paris and Rome, where food is one of the quintessential defining elements of Italian and French culture, to have McDonald's or, Colonel Saunders coming in is a destruction of French civilization. Okay, so this is the logic of these patronage markets and more is something that Priscilla and I did a paper on, where we contrasted patrons who, like the church in the Middle Ages, publishers, the way Bourdieu would talk about them, and prizes. And what we looked at was ways in which you could capture public opinion of citizens in eras before there were any surveys of New York Times bestsellers or of citizens in survey research and whatever. And so in past centuries, one could say, which books were the most popular? From the book reviews, from the big media that were being most widely discussed and debated. And so you could see that Balzac in the early 19th century was a key popular figure, Stendhal, then later on Proust, and so forth. And then see this, and that these were very important defining elements, especially in the Latin Quarter, where there were lots of bookstores, and where people would talk about these. The French addition to this, which I've reminded, or I'll tell you and remind you again, where in China, what's the historic origin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences? Wen Mao, or probably Yiling Lin, you're our science expert. Where does the Chinese Academy of Science come from?
what does it mean by saying where does it come from?
Well, I mean, name 3 countries that got to China. And
I think basically because the center of the academic is from United States, so United States may be a source of the academic of in China, and also the Europe country, or the yeah, because basically the academic in China presently is still in the youth stage, and because the system is not very well structured in China compared with that in the Western countries.
Okay, the first country you mentioned was the US. Is there an Academy of Science in the US?
I am not sure. Do you mean the Academy of Science is a institution, or?
No, I'm cutting you off only because we're not going to have discussion if we go on too much detail. Quick answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
Is no Academy of Science. There is no Academy of Letters. There is no Academy of the French Academy. I'm giving you a hint. There is no Academy of Social Sciences. These exist in those names only in originally in France. And the French took the idea from the Italians. So in Italy, there were little individual academies in a particular city like Florence or Milan, and they might have been under one scientist or one city hall, but they became major national actors under the same guy I mentioned, Francis I, who built the castles. So he took them from Italy, but he made them bigger and better. And they in turn were taken over they were taken over in Russia with the Soviet system. And the central strong state said, and this was Francis I, this was Lenin, this was Stalin, they said, I want to have control of people's minds as well as their as well as other things. And I want the best minds in science to work for me, for the state. That's not an American conception of federal decentralization to the programmers. It's the opposite. We want to politicize science and make it hierarchically responsive. Okay, and so the model then was naturally adopted by the Chinese after 1945 because it came from Russia to China, but it came to Russia from France, and from France, and it was developed for the same basic reasons. We want to control, and we don't want to leave this to the private individual journals, the individual universities, the individual professors. We want to control from the top. So in terms of the paper, which is on the reading list, it's called Prizes. How can you, if you're the head of an Academy of Science in China today, change the working of science or novels or paintings to be more responsive to the cultural policy that is adopted in the 5-year plan? You can give prizes. So look at the numbers of prizes that you get in France and in China that are on people's resumes, that I won the prize for being the best student in German literature or English literature, and I ranked first or 14th in all of China out of hundreds of thousands of other. I mean, that people regularly put that on their resume in China. Okay, so I'm saying prizes can be an important tool, more positive. It's a positive reinforcement, as the psychologists say. It's a reward for doing the right thing, not just censoring the wrong thing. So the psychologists will say you can win more followers if you reward the good people instead of just punishing the bad. All right, so it's part of history of science that is still with us today. And is something which is also measured and included in James Evans's analyses, in which he talks about too. Okay. Other questions or comments? We've got 18 minutes, whatever. Or no, we go to 7:20 or 7:30. I can't remember. What time is it? 7:20. Okay, now we have 7 minutes. Is that right? Yeah. So when someone read the syllabus and correct me. Keep me on time, please. I'll look at that. No, that's the other syllabus. But comments, questions on any of this, especially related to your papers or your own thinking and struggling. Yeah, 7:20. We got 7. Got to think fast.
Yeah, so this question is also about my topic around the innovations in science, because today's reading is about say that the civic culture, they are slow because they say the ideology is slow in moving from one country to another, like the idea of democracies works well in one country, but will not work well in other country. But I think the slow diffusion also exists in the science and technology. Like there might be some new ideas in every decade, but we have to wait for the right timing for new ideas to come true. Like the Microsoft have invented the things like similar to the iPad many years ago before iPad was invited, but it was the iPad that was invited, and then it was published. It was it was circulated around the society. So I'm kind of thinking the slow move is just the slow diffusion also exists in no matter what kind of the systems. So my question is about does this slow diffusion is a general pattern in no matter what kind of system we are talking about, or is there still some differences or distinction that we need to be pay special attention to?
Yeah, there is a literature and a concept in social science called diffusion, and it was part of cultural analysis in this course. And with more time, we would have had a whole section on it, but we're cut back from 10 to 9 weeks. And I mentioned at the very end the name of Gabriel Tarde, T-A-R-D-E. And my first book was on Gabriel Tarde, and he was a competitor of Emil Durkheim. And so Durkheim talked about the society as being oppressive and being strong and making things being happen and being constrained be through the state. Tarde took the opposite view. He talked about salons, and one of his most famous essays was on conversation. And he would talk about styles and how clothing styles, fashion, these things could diffuse, as well as crimes. One person would commit a particularly horrifying crime in a particular way, and it would be diffused. Other people would commit the same crime just a few days later. That happens today around the world. So diffusion is definitely a social process, but there are many, I won't say it's a small literature. There's not a big literature, but there works on it, and one can, and people do, especially geographers, study diffusion of different things, whether it's clothing styles or food, and I won't say obviously, but all of the modern big data where you can find the consumption. Well, you can find maps both of production, say of where were cars produced. Then you can find where are people buying SUVs, or who's buying sports cars, or who's buying a hybrid kind of car, and which kinds of neighborhoods, and where does this diffuse from one person to the next. So I'll just mention I mentioned Georg Simmel and Gabrielle Tard, they're there. Yeah, I'm just running through the other works that we're not including in the main syllabus, but Tard is the most obvious one here. The collaborator of Lazarsfeld is Katz, Elihu Katz. He was a professor of communication at Pennsylvania, and he was also, for 5 years or so, he was the director of television in Israel. He was the head of the whole television system of the state of Israel. Then he came back, and so he's published a new book on the idea of conversation of Tard, and he brings all these ideas. He has what I'm asking you to do. He has many propositions, hypotheses stated as individual testable ideas, and then he summarizes some of the ways that these have been tested. And he uses diffusion ideas as these are classically cited. I mentioned here Bruno Latour is a French theorist. Latour has a chair in Paris, and it's called the Gabrielle Tard Professorship. And he chose the name because he wanted to honor Gabrielle Tard and continue this kind of work. So look up Gabrielle Tard, Bruno Latour, and Elihu Katz, and you can find some work on diffusion.
Thank you.
Good. And it's not a yes or a no, it's not high or low. It's like everything else. It's variable. It depends on the centralization, on funding, on talent, on people's social connections, on institutional connections, which may be hierarchical, or there may be the computer programmers. All these things go in and affect diffusion patterns. But it's an important, valuable thing to focus on in studying science, as well as cultural, as well as marketing, as well as impacts of marketing, as well as choices of individual consumers, and where they may leave if they want to have more of SUVs or clean air or skiing or something else, or Chinese historical art. All right, we're at 7:21. We will officially end, but stay on a little bit if anybody has something you want to, or that is there anybody else who wants to raise something that might affect all of you? I asked this at the beginning of class. Anything else that anybody, and so you can all leave right now if you got a plane to catch, or you can stay on a little bit if someone wants to raise something that might be shared in terms of your papers. But let me add, we will try to include a little more time each of the days for the rest of the quarter. And we have the last class, I think, for student paper presentations. But each week, we can do a little more general discussion as we did at the beginning today, if there are things which, that is, some of you may be having the same questions. How do I build a proposition when I never heard of that word we began with P before? Just X leads to Y, that's all. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I have one. I want to be quick, but I do have one question. So for the causal model discussion, where should that kind of language really sit in a master's thesis paper? Is that embedded in the discussion section when you analyze your data?
I would say ideally from beginning to end, that if you have a review of the literature, say like Gabrielle Tard, and where might ideas diffuse faster about, say, fashion? Is it from high status women to low status women? That's what Bourdieu says. Or is it the opposite? Is it from low status women to high status women, as Baudelaire says? Two opposing hypotheses by smart people using their central concepts. And how does this relate to retirement? That is, you could follow up for women who are very interested. I'll say, I'm a bike racer. I've found that guys who win the races among, say, people over 40, 45. Some of the guys who ride the fastest and best have just retired. Usually that used to be about 65. So the classes from 65 to 70, those guys were really in good shape. They retired from working 40 or 80 hours a week, and they biked for 40 or 80 hours a week. Whereas the guys who were 55 or 60 were still working and they weren't biking as much. So in that sense, you can apply what you do after you stop one kind of good work and then do another kind of good work, and then try to, so I'm giving you an example of trying to put together 2 or 3 variables where you may have, it's top down, no, it's bottom up, and then why might it be either or both? And so that could be the third proposition, a contextual proposition, which says, why is it bottom up instead of top down? Anybody remember this from our, I can't remember if I summarized this orally or not, but if you read a little bit about the essay, the 20-page essay by Benjamin on Paris, this is there. Okay. Anybody else?
Could I just stay on a few minutes after for questions?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Oh, just for office hours, not for general
Yeah,
questions.
well, let's shut off the recording, then we'll start it again for office hours if you want.